This is Ann Maltese speaking. As Holly mentioned, I lead our insights team here at Quantum Workplace. That team is really our subject matter experts on employee engagement, as well as the changing world of performance, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. So when I'm not kind of deep in the trenches of employee engagement, you'll find me hanging out with my husband, Alex, and our dog, Andy, a chocolate lab. And Teresa and I both are based out of Omaha. So I'll turn it over to Teresa for a more in-depth introduction.
Thank you, Anne. So as previously mentioned, the majority of my career has been spent as an HR practitioner. So excited to be here with Quantum Workplace, working with customers to help move the needle on engagement. So in my spare time, I enjoy spending time with my family, and I enjoy baking as well. So we have a lot of good content to cover today on power performance. Okay, and there are pictures again, so you'll learn a little bit more about who we are. So first off, we want to dive into the tensions surrounding performance management. So how to overcome barriers, lessons for managers, and how HR can support those managers. So we're aiming to have a few minutes at the end for your questions as well. So make sure you're submitting those as we go. The first thing we are going to start off with today is a little quiz. Don't worry, this is just to get everyone thinking about our topic today. So just thinking to yourself, what % of HR tech buyers believe performance management is a waste of time? I'll give you a few minutes to think through that here. All right, so did you get it right? 46% of HR tech buyers actually believe performance management is a waste of time. That means before they have identified a solution, they may not necessarily even feel the project is valuable for the organization. That in and of itself can lead to a lot of tension. So the past few years have really seen a shift. HR is losing, or some would say HR has already lost faith in the performance management methods of the past. Even more concerning is that employees themselves are losing faith in the ability of HR to help them perform better. So as you can see on the slide here, only about 29% of employees actually believe HR helps them perform better. So discussions and thought leadership around this topic has shifted from performance management mindsets to more of performance conversations. Unfortunately, making meaningful change is not as easy as just changing the phrase that we use. So it's caused us to really take a step back to ask, what is the root cause of the performance conundrum? So I'll let you sit on that for a moment because I actually have another quiz question for you. So let's take a second to think about what % of managers believe they know how to make behavior change sustainable. So I'll let you think on that for a moment. So the answer to this question is actually 9%. Let's think about what that means for a moment. So less than 1 out of 10 managers know how to make behavior change sustainable. These are the people on the front lines of your organization, and they're feeling unprepared. So the tension really lies in not only do they not know how to make change sustainable, they're lost when it comes to the knowledge and skills they need to help people make meaningful changes to support higher performance and their own engagement at work. So here's another slide just driving home that point. So they're not confident they know how to handle performance conversations. So in a perfect storm of not understanding how to measure, track, motivate, and talk about performance, as well as the managers themselves at times maybe being promoted because while they're good at their jobs, they don't necessarily have the skill set to manage. So they're expected to go from maybe being a technical expert or being really good at the individual contributor portion of their job, and then they're expected to nurture, develop, coach, and quite frankly, have really difficult conversations, oftentimes without the necessary training and guidance to really set them up for success. So we wanted to look at, what's the solution to that? So here it is, people. Coach and develop the people who coach and develop your people. So as HR, you often have many, many hats to wear. Time is at a premium, but by ensuring your people leaders effectively recognize employees when they're doing well, but even more importantly, are able to coach them when they may be struggling or need improvement or need overall guidance. So this approach will pay dividends, but it does take time and work. So with those pieces of information in mind, I'm going to kick it over to Anne for more information on how managers can hold more effective conversations.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. Those are definitely some startling statistics, and I'm sure some of you may not have been surprised by those, or others maybe a little feeling like a punch in the gut, because this is something that you yourselves may be working really hard on, or thinking about how your organization can really be thinking through this. But that's why we're here today. So this next section is really going to dive into 5 manager lessons for engaging performance conversations. And so each of these 5 that you're seeing here, we'll walk through in more detail. Ultimately, we want to be able to set you all up to help coach your managers on these lessons, really setting them up for success, helping them feel prepared, which helps their employees, and in turn helps the organization. So we'll dive through these 5, and then as we go through them, I'll turn it back over to Teresa at the end so we can really talk in even more detail about the role that HR can play. So let's go ahead and dive into our first lesson, which is all about the invitation. Now, you might see this and immediately think this is basic advice about sending a calendar invitation, that your manager should be doing this when they want to have a performance conversation with an employee. And actually, that is part of it. So instead of a manager maybe seeing an employee walk down the hallway, walk by their office, and saying, hey, can you step in here for a minute? That's really going to maybe make that employee feel tense. They're going to think, what's up? What's going on? They can have a lot of anxiety. So if a manager truly wants to have an effective conversation with an employee, they should really be devoting time so that both the manager and the employee feel prepared. But beyond just thinking about physical time, we also want managers to really be thinking about emotional time too. And so a conversation about performance, if it's a performance improvement conversation, or even if it's something a little bit more minor, that's still a high anxiety conversation. So really thinking about the emotional aspect of this is important when your managers are scheduling these meetings. So for example, if your manager only has a 30-minute time slot available, and they're saying, well, I guess I'll just schedule it at that point, they're really not setting themselves up for success, because they may be going into that meeting rushed. They have to end it very abruptly and go on to their next meeting. But we also want them to be thinking about the employee as well. Let's say it is going to be maybe a little bit more of a difficult conversation. They can be thinking about scheduling this where maybe the employee can take the rest of the day off, or at least they're not having a lot of meetings right after this. They might be digesting what is discussed. They might even be feeling a little emotional or upset. So really the point here is that managers should be intentional about both the calendar time as well as the emotional time of employees and themselves. So that might sound really simple, but again, that's a common mistake that managers may make. Next, with the invitation, we want managers to really be mindful about picking a location. So they might kind of go on autopilot and just think, well, I'm just going to schedule it in my office, of course. Why wouldn't I do that? But choosing a location can actually be a trigger for assumptions that an employee might have about this conversation, or it can cause an emotional reaction of employees. So different locations tend to trigger different reactions from employees. So if the manager's setting it in the office, and let's say they have an office with a closed door, and this is pretty uncommon to have a meeting in there, that might lead that employee to think, oh, this is a serious topic. This is a serious conversation. We're in a private setting. That could lead to an emotional reaction of the employee. If the manager schedules it in a common area, that employee is probably going to assume it can't be that serious. We're out in the open where anyone can see us and maybe listen in. Or if it's scheduled even in a conference room with a big boardroom table, they might think, are other people joining or are other people part of this conversation? Here at Quantum Workplace, we actually do a lot of our one-on-one meetings, whether they're about performance or career development or really any topic outside of the office, whether that's taking the employee out for coffee, whether that's having lunch together. We're really removing ourselves from that office environment, trying to be mindful of those emotional reactions and get into a little bit of a habit of that. But regardless of where your managers are scheduling the meeting, our advice here is really just to be mindful about what the location suggests, and so that they can be picking the right type of location to have their meeting in. Now, finally, before this invitation can be sent, we want your managers to be thinking through expectation setting. And a lot of this is sending a clear agenda in the meeting invitation. An agenda is going to ease the nerves of the employee a little bit because they're going to know what to expect. What is it that this meeting is about? What are some of the things that we are going to be discussing? So not only is that helping the manager think through how this conversation might look, but it's also helping your your employee really prepare and feel a little bit more at ease. Now, as a manager myself, I know saying this is easier than doing this. What should I title the meeting? What should those agenda points really be? A good piece of advice, and what we use at Quantum Workplace, is a GOOD, G-O-O-D, which stands for goals, obstacles, opportunities, and decisions. So that type of agenda really works for a lot of different conversations. So if your managers are really struggling through the basics of how do I set this agenda, that is certainly something that you can share with them, and it can help the conversation flow through both the good things as well as some of the challenges or the opportunities. All right, so at this point, the invitation can be sent, but we're really just getting started. So next, our lesson is around the preparation. And this is something that we want to be very transparent about, that these types of conversations do take preparation in order for them to be effective for both the manager and for the employee. And so our first aspect of this lesson is for your manager to share notes ahead of time, as well as asking the employee to share notes ahead of time. So essentially, we're taking that agenda a few steps further. So if we're wanting to talk about, let's say, employee performance, a particular situation that's come up, really calling that out, sharing some detail, sharing what the manager is thinking, but also giving the employee an opportunity to do that as well. This is all about creating transparency, and it's all about really preparing for a more effective conversation. So nobody is feeling blindsided walking into the conversation. So let's walk through a few scenarios here. So let's say that the manager and the employee didn't share notes in advance, and they are talking about performance, and that employee in that conversation shares that, you know what, actually I've been having a tough time at home. We have a few different things going on, and I know I'm not bringing my best self to work. I'm very distracted. That employee might actually ask if they can have some flexibility or if they can work remotely for a while. Had they been able to share that in advance, the manager could have actually come prepared to that conversation with a few solutions. Instead of maybe saying, you know what, I'm not sure. I don't know how to handle this situation. I'm not familiar with our policies. I'll have to check. Now, you certainly still want to have a thoughtful conversation with that employee, even if they're sharing their notes in advance. So it's not replacing the conversation. It's just making that conversation a little bit more effective and even getting to some resolution on some of those discussion points. That scenario that I shared was one that was maybe a little bit more negative in nature, but you could even picture a star employee maybe asking for a pay raise. And again, that manager might be a little bit caught off guard on how to handle that. So the more you know what each party wants to discuss going into that meeting, the more effective the conversation can be. In addition to sharing notes ahead of time, we also want the manager to really be anticipating any negative responses that the employee might have. So again, let's think about these tough, potentially emotional performance conversations. There's a few reasons why receiving feedback is really tough. So for your manager, certainly sharing feedback, critical feedback especially, is tough, but receiving it is often even harder. And there's a few reasons why. So first, our human egos sometimes don't even allow us to know that we need to improve. So Marshall Goldsmith is an executive coach and an author, and he once shared a stat that 70% of us believe that we're in the top 10% of our peer group. So again, we might not even realize that we have a need to improve or that anything is wrong. Beyond our egos, sometimes our brain can view feedback as threatening, or sometimes it can even cause a fearful response. That can lead an employee to maybe feel defensive and start kind of arguing about the conversation, or they can maybe just shut down and have kind of a very quiet reaction. And so managers should be going into these conversations or these meetings feeling prepared. We do want them to have a positive attitude, not to be kind of paralyzed by all of the negative things that could happen, but still taking time to think about, if this reaction happens, how would I handle it? So that way they're really able to navigate through some of those challenges. And then finally, in the preparation, we want your managers to be doing their research before entering the conversation. So yes, they've already shared notes, they've already anticipated negative responses, but a manager oftentimes only has their own point of view about an employee, and that might be limited. They might not get to see or experience all of the work that an employee does, or they might have heard about it from either customers or clients or the coworkers, but it's a really good idea to ask for feedback from others before going into these conversations. And it doesn't have to be asking coworkers to tattle or to share just negative things about an employee. A good exercise here, if you're asking for feedback, is to ask folks, whether it's external folks like your clients or customers, or internal folks, what's one thing that this employee really does well? What's one thing about them that you really appreciate? But what is also one thing that this employee could do better? Where should they focus on improving? So that way you're getting a little bit of that balanced feedback, and you're able to take it into the conversation, and you're able to add more context, more examples. Otherwise, that employee might just be hearing your own point of view and feel like, you know what, that's not really fair. You don't see my work. You don't understand my work. And so a manager would be coming in a lot better equipped to really talk through and, again, navigate that conversation. All right. So going on to our third lesson for managers, it's really about the conversation itself. And so we want to make sure that managers are starting these conversations off on the right foot. So this isn't about beating around the bush or avoiding the topic of conversation, but it's more about a manager recognizing that an employee on the other side of the table is a human being. And that human being has emotions, and they should really be acknowledging that. So really, to start these conversations off, you can just simply ask how the employee is doing. Maybe ask for some good news. What's going on in your family? Anything that I should be aware of as your manager? Or the manager can also say, Something like, you might be feeling a little anxious right now. Just really kind of trying to acknowledge how that employee might be feeling really can set the tone and make that employee feel cared about and respected, even if the conversation might be a little tense. Secondly, during the conversation, we want your managers to really be focusing their attention. And this is tough. We are all connected to our phones, to our computers. We might use things like Slack. We're always on email. We might be trying to take notes during this conversation. But having technology in front of us can really make us feel disconnected. And an employee might feel like, you know what, I really don't feel like my manager's here in the moment with me. They don't seem focused on me. I think they're taking notes, but it also seems like they're distracted by their calendar or they're distracted by the emails coming into their inbox. So we really essentially advise those managers not to have any technology in front of them. Now, technology can play a role in these conversations, and we'll go through that in more detail during lesson 5. But for right now, this is all about being present. And I say this in terms of a performance conversation, but I think we can all maybe shake our heads a little bit or nod in agreement that this is really just good life advice too, trying to be more present in the moment and focused on the people around us. Next, in the conversation, we want your managers to really be listening as much as they're talking. And this one can sometimes seem surprising. So the manager is the one who scheduled the meeting. The manager might feel like, I'm facilitating this conversation. But this is a conversation, which by definition means two-way. And this is really a good opportunity for your employees to feel like they have a voice and that their opinion matters. Those types of perceptions are actually really important in employee engagement. We know when employees feel like their opinion is heard and that it counts, they're actually more likely to be engaged. And the same is true even in these types of conversations about performance. So how can your managers go about this? Well, first, they can ask questions. So taking time to maybe ask the employee, after you've gone through a scenario where maybe performance wasn't at its best, what would you have done differently? If you were able to go back in time, or if you encounter this again in the future, what would you do? That type of question is really having the employee think through, taking the time to really think about it and kind of learn from their past experience. They can feel more ownership of their behaviors. Beyond asking questions, managers can simply take time to pause. I know sometimes we get going, we have certain points that we want to make. We want to make sure that we're covering our agenda, but really just taking a breath, letting the employee digest a little bit, and then seeing after they've digested if they have anything that they want to chime in, anything that they want to ask. But I also think it's important for managers to realize, even if they're taking these approaches, some employees might just feel uncomfortable. They might just be quiet in these situations. They might not feel like they can respond honestly. That requires trust between the manager and the employee for that employee to really feel like they can do that. And I think it's humbling sometimes, but it's really important for your managers to realize building trusting relationships with their direct reports is really important. And that trust is what allows these conversations to be more effective over time. Now, wrapping up our third lesson, the last point that we want to cover here is really remaining objective. This is about your manager staying calm, keeping their emotions in check, even if the conversation potentially gets a little heated or gets emotional. So picture maybe an employee getting upset. Maybe they start crying. How will that manager handle the situation? Or maybe the employee is very frustrated. They're getting a little angry. Again, not allowing the manager's emotions to come into play here. But I know, again, that's something that's easier said than done, and I've been talking quite a bit. So I'm going to turn it over to Teresa. Teresa, in your HR experience, what would you add here?
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, as Anne mentioned, these conversations can be very difficult. This is hard, quite frankly. So ensuring that you're maintaining focus while also being empathetic to the employee is extremely important in these situations. And it's very, very easy to be tipped off balance. So a lot of times what I've seen in the past is managers either plowing through, leaving the employee maybe feeling like they were just hit with something unexpected, and not taking the time to listen and to be empathetic with that employee. Or to the other extreme, it can be easy to, as a manager, let your emotions take over, and then you reach the end of the meeting and you realize you didn't cover the topics in full. So really maintaining that focus, as Anne mentioned, maintaining that focus on what are the pieces of the conversation we need to cover, being empathetic. Again, this goes back to the preparation piece and even the meeting invitation, making sure you have adequate time. It may take more time than you anticipated. So leaving some of those variables open so you're not boxed in so tightly into how you think the conversation is going to go. And then when the conversation is wrapping up, really ensuring you're checking for understanding. And then as Anne is going to go into next, really making sure you're following up.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. It's always good to hear your point of view. Good. So then we'll transition to our fourth of 5 total lessons that we can be thinking about for managers. And the fourth one is about follow-up. So here, as they're wrapping up this initial conversation with an employee, they should really be kind of recapping at the end, what are the decisions that we made? What are the next steps that we need to be deciding? What's the timing of those next steps? When are we going to meet again to discuss the progress that's being made? But also making sure that the employee is feeling aligned, checking for their understanding, making sure that they're on the same page. And so every good conversation should really end making sure that that manager and employee is aligned. But after that meeting stops, it doesn't mean the conversation stops. The conversation should really be ongoing. So as you're leaving, I would suggest kind of making sure that alignment exists, but also documenting it. Documenting it not just for the manager, but also so the employee can see too, so that you both have full visibility into what was discussed, what those next steps look like, or what the timing looks like. And so you can reference those notes later. And then beyond that, really having your managers check in on progress. Again, it's about a continuous conversation throughout the year, not just that initial conversation or meeting that happened. And so as a manager, you're really a coach for your employees. You want to help them succeed, or you should feel like you want them to succeed. So I know we're speaking to HR here, but really we want to have that same mentality, but also make sure that our managers have that same mentality as well. And so whether it's weekly, whether it's bi-weekly, at some regular cadence, we need to make sure that we're continuing the conversation, that we're making progress, or if it's a performance improvement plan, and let's say performance isn't improving, what happens at that point? So making sure that we're continuing to check in. All right, we've made it to our 5th and final lesson for managers. This is really all about leveraging tools. No manager is perfect. You can take all of the time in the world to think about this, to prepare, to have experience, but it's still good to leverage resources available to you. And so, for example, we'll have an ebook that you'll see in just a few slides that's really all about this topic that we're discussing today. That can be a great resource to share for your managers, as well as other articles, tips, checklists about these types of topics. And then Teresa will cover this more in just a few minutes, but really seeing HR as a resource. How can you help your managers through coaching, through things like role playing, or making sure that they're really able to ask you questions or kind of use you as a thought partner? Beyond resources, also considering templates to facilitate these types of conversation as a tool that your managers can use. And so when I say templates, these can be basically conversation starters, or they can be just basically walking you through different things to discuss in these types of conversations. And so we have a few resources at Quantum Workplace that are great for your managers. A big book of 350 one-on-one questions, as an example, basically gives your managers some questions that they can use to initiate these conversations. How do I kick off a conversation about performance improvement? Or maybe it's a more positive conversation like career development, but that can still be really challenging. So if you share a few questions that can kick off the conversation, again, it can set your managers up for greater success in these meetings. At Quantum Workplace, we also have different one-on-one templates that can be used. You're seeing one on the screen here, kind of on the slide. For example, I talked about the good template earlier: goals, obstacles, opportunities, and decisions, as well as conversation templates for performance improvement, for performance evaluation. Again, these are things that can really be making it easier on your managers. And then finally, speaking of easy, making sure they have software to really streamline this process. So along the way in our lessons, we talked about how it's a good idea for your managers to ask for feedback about an employee from others. We talked about how you can share notes and prepare for one-on-one conversations, or document what you discussed in those conversations. You can think about setting goals and tracking those goals along the way. So we really recommend using technology to help these managers, really kind of automating some of the process, making it easy, not having them have 17 notebooks about each employee, which we've seen before. Again, really just trying to streamline things. So it's hard enough to prepare for the conversations. It's hard enough to think through the emotional response of our employees. So things like these different tools that we've described are at least trying to make it a little bit easier for them. So now that we've covered these 5 lessons, we do want to mention the ebook. And so you'll be able to download the ebook at quantumworkplace.com/5lessons. And this is really going to go in more detail about a lot of what we talked about today rather. But we're not done yet. So far we've really covered 5 lessons for managers, but we know many of you are in an HR role. So I'm going to turn it back over to Teresa, and she's going to walk through really the role that you all can play beyond what we've already discussed.
Thank you, Anne. I appreciate it. So as I'm talking to all of you, I can definitely empathize and identify with you. I've been in your shoes for a long time. So wanted to walk through kind of 4 points that can really help you support those individuals who are supporting your employee population. So number 1, offering guidance and resources. So helping our managers understand that you are available to offer guidance and resources, I think, is extremely important. This really comes back to debunking the myth that once someone becomes a manager, they should know all and they don't need to ask for help. I've seen it time and time again where new managers especially feel like, oh, do I have the opportunity to ask questions? I should know these things. I was promoted to this role. But that isn't always the case. Helping them understand that it's not only okay to ask for help, it is expected to ask for help, because managing is really hard, as we all know. So the second guideline, as we learned earlier, less than 1 in 10 managers know how to make behavior change sustainable in their people. And as Anne discussed, preparation is extremely important to those productive conversations that help support the manager in making change sustainable in their people. So help your managers prepare by not only offering those resources, but by even simply walking through the conversations and helping them to anticipate those potential employee reactions so they're less likely to be derailed if something surprises them. A lot of times HR tends to have a broader view of the organization and can offer context for maybe certain employees, or context in what maybe you've seen before, because you really have exposure to a lot more than the individual manager does. And so number 3, this is one of my favorite exercises I used to do with my managers when I was practicing HR, role playing. So while it may feel silly at first, I've really found role playing to be very helpful when managers are entering a potentially uncomfortable situation. So actually practicing and talking out their points out loud helps both you as HR and the manager discover points where they might not be as confident as you would like, or where they may be saying something out of context. So running through these types of conversations through your head is good preparation, but actually speaking it out loud tends to take it one step further and really help call out those pieces that aren't quite prepared in full. So number 4, thinking back to the first quiz question, a whopping 46% of you feel that performance management is a waste of time. That's concerning, very concerning. So let's do something about it, right? You can be an advocate in your own organization for a different approach to performance management, one with continuous conversations at all levels of the organization. It will take work and change management skills, but it's definitely worth it. So we encourage you to explore that type of methodology when it comes to performance management. We've seen that that's when employees really, really tend to thrive and be more engaged in their day-to-day work. All right, Holly, we are actually ready for some questions from the audience.
All right, sounds good to me. We'll go ahead and skip over to this slide, which will remind you that that question and answer box can be found right underneath the webcast video player. And without further ado, we have had an explosion of questions asking you to please repeat what that acronym GOOD stands for.
I can certainly do that. So GOOD is goals, obstacles, opportunities, and the decisions. I've seen a few different actually acronyms of it before, but that's what we use. And so you're able to talk about kind of goals. What is the employee striving for? What is the team striving for? What is the organization striving for? What are some of the obstacles that might be in the way? What are some opportunities that we have to really make progress on those goals? And then what are some decisions that need to be made, kind of leaving that conversation?
All right, awesome. Thanks for going over that again. A lot of people were curious about it, so that's a good thing. And now we've got that back out there. So let's see. Next question that we have comes from member S. Thomas. What is the role of confidentiality in building trust with employees?
Good question. So confidentiality, I think that is definitely important in terms of this is a sensitive, if we're talking about performance conversations or really any conversation that the manager and the employee might be having, there is that level of sensitivity and there is that level of trust. However, I think it's important for managers to understand that sometimes HR needs visibility into those conversations. Or if we're asking for feedback from others, maybe that manager being transparent and saying, hey, I did ask for feedback and I'm not trying to, incriminate you or do anything wrong. I'm just trying to broaden my understanding. And I think sharing some of that feedback, just like you would be in those conversations, is important. So I think it's important for managers to really be thoughtful as well as transparent with employees so that employees know when things are confidential, when they may not be, when others might have visibility into some of these conversations, but also why. Teresa, is there anything you would add there?
No, I agree, Anne. I think the transparency angle is really refreshing for employees. But as I anticipate some of you may be thinking, oh, how transparent can we be while keeping confidential matters confidential, right? So I think really treating your employees as the adults that they are and helping them understand, okay, these are the things I can share with you. but there are some pieces of this that I'm not able to share with you. And even just being upfront with them and transparent with them in that way can really help build that trust, because they know, okay, obviously I know that there are things that go on in the business that I may not be privy to, at least not yet, but at least I don't feel like my manager is being deceptive, right? So really just being very honest and being transparent about what you can share and what you may not be able to share.
All right, thanks so much, guys. And then one other tool, I should say, that a lot of people are asking about is the reminder of where the one-on-one meeting templates can be found for manager conversations.
Great. So one of the things that I mentioned is a big book of 350 one-on-one questions that managers can access. You can actually find that on quantumworkplace.com under our resources section. And then in terms of templates, we have some of those in our various ebooks. And then organizations that actually partner with Quantum Workplace using our software, using our tools for engagement and performance, will also have some additional templates. So definitely some in our resources on qw.com or quantumworkplace.com rather, but then also some that our customers get access to in addition to that. So definitely a lot of resources, free resources out there for you, even if you're not partnering with Quantum Workplace right now.
All right, sounds excellent. So then a follow-up that we have from S. Thomas is saying that the past HR role in my company has been punitive. And how would you say we can shift that thinking?
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself there. No, thank you for that question. I think the past of HR maybe tended towards the more punitive route, and as I alluded to previously, I think it comes to a shift in mentality of who your employees are. You hired smart people to help your organization succeed, and trying to help upper management or maybe ingrained managers that may have the past practice kind of ingrained in their day to day, helping them understand that employees really are an asset and a resource in and of themselves, and making sure that you're showing the benefit of how taking this type of approach can help your engagement and your employee and your employees and your culture overall. So one tactic that we found to be effective is maybe start to make inroads with those more progressive managers in your organization, and kind of maybe run some pilot conversations with them, or kind of help them understand, get them on your side a little bit if you can, and then once you have maybe some success stories from those conversations that they may have had, or situations that you've worked through with them, then use those as, see, we can do this here. This worked in this situation. And the more you kind of build up your experiences with those positive outcomes, the more inroads you're going to be able to make with those people who may be a little bit more stuck in the ways of the past. So again, that's by no means a quick fix, excuse me. It will take time, and it does take a lot of continuous effort, but it's very much worth it in the end, and you'll start to slowly see that culture shift, and I think you'll be pleased with the results.
All right, great, thanks. So next question that we have comes from Betty. To what level do you give coaching to the employee to help them also prepare for the meaningful conversations?
That's a great question. I think whenever we're rolling out a change in performance, the approach to performance, maybe moving to more of the continuous conversations, or even if you're not, I think it's not just beneficial to communicate and help educate your managers, but also your employees. your employees play a role in their own engagement, in their own performance, and in the engagement of others as well. And so I do think that's really important. And so in terms of preparing them, I think it's helping them understand we want to make sure that you are set up for success, that your manager can be building a healthy, trusting relationship and can serve as a coach for you. And so I think when your employees kind of know what to expect to say, gosh, we're going to have maybe quarterly one-on-ones, or maybe we're going to have one-on-ones every month. What is the benefit? How can they come prepared and kind of know what to expect out of those types of conversations? And so even as we've seen organizations maybe evolve to a continuous conversation model away from that annual performance review, some lay out what the year ahead looks like. And so maybe once a quarter, a manager and employee are meeting to talk about goal progress. And so we know going into that conversation that that's heavily what that conversation is about. But in addition to those conversations, we recommend that managers and employees devote at least one conversation in the year to career development. So we're actually thinking ahead. We're thinking about how can we help you grow and learn, even if you don't change maybe what your role is year to year. And then kind of having other conversations throughout the year as needed. And so I think if you paint that roadmap for your employees and allow them to know what to expect, it can really make them active participants in the conversation and actually excited about the prospect of having these conversations versus not knowing or kind of not understanding why you may be making a change.
All right, sounds great. Thanks for that information. So we'll stay on the topic of performance improvement and coaching, but let's talk about your remote employees. Question comes from Jessica. What is the best way to conduct a performance improvement conversation with a remote worker?
Good question. Yeah, we're seeing obviously more and more of that just kind of as the work market and the workplace changes. I would say that thinking about the conversation itself, if you have any technology that allows you to share your camera, I would really encourage that. So maybe doing a video conference or a video chat. First and foremost, kind of avoiding an email back and forth or avoiding that conversation being just in text, because there's a lot of different ways that you might misinterpret tone in just written word. So that's the most basic, but I think taking it a step further, beyond just having a phone conversation, really being able to look at somebody's face expression and really being able to see how are they reacting to this? Are they pausing? Are they digesting? Is so powerful. So I think trying to have these conversations using some sort of video communication would definitely be ideal. We know that travel isn't always possible. So I think really just trying to leverage the technology that is available, but following a lot of the same steps otherwise that we talked about. So sharing the agenda in advance, really taking time to prepare, still having all of the follow-up, but really maybe seeing that meeting as being kind of a video conference together. But again, maybe ensuring that those managers are setting that expectation. The last thing that an employee would want is to hear at minute one of the conversation, hey, why don't you turn your video camera on? And then suddenly it's like, well, I've never had to do my hair before. I typically work from home, so now I'm even more anxious. So again, just being really thoughtful and intentional in advance if that is an expectation that you'd like to set.
All right, good information there. Thanks again. Next two questions that we have coming up are really interesting. So let's talk about things like addressing presence. And so this actual question comes from Eric. What are your recommendations for addressing things like presence and things that are sort of abstract concepts, such as that with a leader?
So I can take this one. In terms of, if I'm interpreting this correctly, in terms of actually being present in the moment, I think it's taking it back to how would you feel if you were in a conversation with your leader and they were distracted? and really driving it home with them. I've had a lot of conversations with upper level leaders that just bringing to light the context around the situation and the feelings of the other person can help them take a step back and really concentrate on, okay, this is a human being. This is a person with feelings and a life outside of work, and how can I respect them in the best way possible while still, maintaining that authority or maintaining that professionalism, right? That's a very very tricky balance. But I think bringing it back to how would you like to be treated in this situation and really having that empathy.
And I would just add, even this is where role playing can come into play. I think if you've been in a situation where you're talking with somebody and they have their computer up in front of them and it kind of looks like they're spending more time looking at their screen than looking at you, I think that can immediately build some empathy in your managers and really kind of have them realize, oh, that's what that maybe what we're talking about really feels like and what it looks like.
All right, great. And then it turns out Eric lets us know that he meant more of a professional presence, maybe not so much present in the moment. So maybe we could talk about that angle as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of professional presence, we see a lot of shift in the workplace from having maybe a position of power or being in a situation where you feel like you have to exert that maybe power over someone else. So maintaining professionalism is important, but I also feel that perception is shifting somewhat in terms of knowing that you can be professional while still being a human being and really maintaining that empathy for your workforce. And I would argue that having empathy for your workforce, being empathetic, and really understanding that your workforce is full of human beings is a part of maintaining a professional presence instead of maybe being, whether it's distracted or feeling like you have to immediately put on a face of authority, if you will. And that it really does have to do with your culture. Here at Quantum Workplace, we're all very much feel like we're on a level playing field. We're all professionals. We all have the ability to chat with whatever level individual we want to. And that, as Anne spoke to previously, that being the norm in our culture really helps some of those more difficult conversations maybe happen more naturally and people not be as anxious about that or have as many reservations about that, because it is more part of the norm, having constructive conversations and having constructive conflict even. But maintaining professional presence is important, but I challenge people to think about what professional presence really means in today's workforce.
All right, great note there. Thank you so much for clearing that up. So let's see, we'll keep on going now, another 5 minutes or so. So next question that we have comes from Lisa. And what are your best practice recommendations to transition naysayer managers to focusing on the conversation? The challenge is commitment or investment of time.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. I think when managers may hear that we're asking them to have continuous conversations, and depending on what that means in your organization, is it monthly, is it quarterly, is it as needed, it can feel like a lot. But of course, we come from a little bit of a biased perspective, but saying, it's worth your time to invest in your people. Again, thinking about yourself as a coach when you're a manager, you need to be making your people more successful. So really investing that time. But I would also say, as we've kind of been studying this, it might actually take less time than the alternative. And so if you're not having regular conversations with an employee, you might be more likely to find yourself having a longer conversation later on where you're having to work on realignment, where you're having to have a deeper conversation about performance that maybe has been off track for quite a while. And even with the annual performance review, to do those at all really well. I would argue that no annual performance review really ever goes super well, but they take a lot of time to prepare for if we're trying not to fall victim to recency bias, where we're just thinking about what happened in the last couple months, but really look back across the whole year. And so if you're having continuous conversations, you're not having to look back as far into the past, and you're really able to see each conversation as kind of a continuous one from the last one. So we're not starting all over. We're not having to invest a ton of time into the preparation. And then beyond that, I would just say kind of some of the emotional impact as well, that when you're having these continuous conversations, there might be less of that emotional impact that can have on, so things like anxiety or just feeling a little uneasy, that can affect your productivity. So both the manager as well as the employee. So there's kind of some hidden downtime there as well. So I think making the case of why it's beneficial, why it's part of the manager role, as well as kind of helping them understand when we get going on this and when we're really firing on all cylinders, it will actually likely take us less time.
All right, great. And then I think we'll only have time for one more question today. This one comes from Chrissy. So could we talk about that one-on-one meeting that you've mentioned and talk about if it should be in addition to an annual review or part of an annual review? So more about how it comes into play during the year.
Ooh, $1 million question. So we work with a lot of organizations, and of course, we also study a lot of organizations that maybe we don't work with to really kind of understand what would our best practice advice be. I would say that one-on-one conversations are those continuous conversations throughout the year, but infused in them, we're still talking about performance. Maybe not every one-on-one conversation. For example, earlier on, I discussed how you might devote one of those in a year to career development, or you might have a different topic about a one-on-one conversation. But typically we're seeing organizations have either a quarterly or perhaps more frequent goals check-in or performance check-in conversation. And so where that annual evaluation might fit is it might just be that last one-on-one conversation in the year. So it's really a recap of all of the previous conversations that we've discussed. Because in quarter one, we talked about goals. We talked about whether the employee was on track or not. We talked about any obstacles in their way. We talked about what priorities they have and where they need to focus. And then in Q2, we continued that conversation. Maybe we talked about new goals, new key results as part of those OKRs, potentially. But again, once you get to that final conversation, whether you call it an annual review or not, it can be more of just the recap, the summary of the past year. But I think the key thing about an annual performance review is really trying to take away a lot of just the bad baggage surrounding that. It takes a lot of preparation. We don't see a lot of employees or managers thinking that they're very effective. They can be very anxiety producing. So even if you have that last conversation kind of be the recap, just trying to maybe break up a little bit with some of the bad connotation with that type of meeting.
All right, awesome. Thanks for that explanation. And so that does take us to the bottom of the hour. We'll go ahead and wrap up by letting everyone know that today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Give us about 24 hours and then you can head on over to your My HCI profile and visit your My Learning Journey to download your transcript. One more big thank you to everyone from Quantum Workplace, including Anne and Teresa, and we do appreciate you for being with us and hope you have a great afternoon.